Before we begin our descent into the labyrinthine and blood-stained life of the man who would become the architect of modern American crime, you must prepare yourself for a truth so shocking it redefines the very nature of justice and power. Imagine a scenario where the most wanted criminal in the nation, a man convicted for crimes so vast they touched every corner of American life, is not in a prison cell, but is instead sitting across from the most powerful agents of the United States government, striking a deal. The year is 1942, and the fate of the nation's ports hangs in the balance. The government, in a moment of desperate, clandestine pragmatism, agrees to a devil's bargain. They need Charles Lucky, Luciano's help to secure the waterfront from Nazi saboteurs, and in return, they offer him not just a reduced sentence, but something far more sinister, far more final, the sanction. Secret assassination of a man named Salvatore, Lucky Luciano's conscience, Maranzano. A murder that had already happened a decade prior, but whose unresolved nature now threatened to expose secrets that reached the highest offices. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented, historical fact buried in declassified wartime files. A moment where the line between good and evil was not just blurred, but was systematically erased by the very institutions sworn to uphold it. This single act of state-sanctioned murder for hire, offered as a token of goodwill to a convicted gangster, is the key that unlocks the true, terrifying legacy of Lucky Luciano, a legacy not of a thug, but of a visionary CEO whose product was violence and whose corporation was the Commission, an entity so powerful it forced the government itself to become a silent, complicit partner. This story, from the gritty streets of LES to the opulent suites of Havana and the quiet, guarded villas of Naples, is a chronicle of how crime was institutionalized, how violence was corporatized, and how one man's ruthless ambition built an empire in the shadows. An empire whose foundations are so deeply embedded in the American psyche that we still feel its echoes in our politics, our economy, and our culture today. But before we step into this world, a crucial disclaimer. The narrative you are about to hear is a meticulously reconstructed tapestry woven from a multitude of sources. FBI vault documents, Senate hearing transcripts, the Kefauver Committee reports, first-hand accounts from associates like Meyer Lansky and Joe Valachi, and biographies from historians like Selwyn Rabb and Tim Newark. This story is not born from a single book or a speculative article. It is a synthesis of verified information, pieced together with the sole intention of presenting you, the listener, with the most comprehensive, accurate, and engaging account possible. Our mission is purely educational, aiming to deliver the unvarnished truth about this pivotal figure in criminal history. So, I urge you to subscribe to this channel, to become a part of our community dedicated to uncovering the stories that shaped our world. Hit the like button if you are ready to begin this journey, and ring the notification bell so you do not miss a single chapter of this sprawling saga. Now, with that said, let us travel back in time to the turn of the 20th century, to the overcrowded, cacophonous, and unforgiving streets of New York's Lower East Side. where a young boy named Salvatore Lucania first learned the brutal arithmetic of power, poverty, and survival. The world that received the 5-year-old Salvatore Lucania in 1906 was a brutal, open-air classroom in the science of human desperation. The Lower East Side was not merely a neighborhood. It was a densely packed human warehouse, a turbulent sea of immigrants where the very air, thick with the smells of coal smoke, rotting garbage, and sweat, seemed to press down with the weight of 1,000,000 shattered dreams. Tenement buildings, those grim, brick-faced canyons, rose precariously on either side of narrow streets that rarely saw sunlight, their fire escapes creating a wrought iron jungle gym for children and a swift, shadowy highway for men on the run. For young Salvatore, this was the only reality he would ever truly acknowledge. His father, Antonio, labored in a sulfur mine in Sicily and now in a garment district factory, embodying an ethos of honest toil that his son viewed not with respect, but with a cold, analytical pity. To Salvatore, that path was a slow, dignified death, a life sentence of anonymous drudgery. The real power, the real education, was not found in the cramped, underfunded classrooms of public school 19U, where his poor English and Sicilian heritage made him a target, but on the cobblestone streets themselves. Here, the law was not written in books, but enforced with fists, knives, and a ruthless understanding of territorial advantage. It was here he formed his first strategic alliance, a gang of fellow outsiders with names that would one day echo through the underworld. Meyer Lansky, the small, fiercely intelligent Jewish boy from Grodno, with a mind for numbers and strategy that far exceeded his years, and Benjamin, Bugsy, Siegel, a tempest of raw, unbridled violence and ambition. This was Luciano's first corporation, his first board of directors. They started small, with a protection racket aimed at other, younger children, extorting a few pennies in exchange for safe passage to school. They graduated to shoplifting, pilfering goods from the pushcarts that lined Hester Street and Orchard Street, learning the fundamentals of supply and demand. But their most ingenious early enterprise was a simple, yet devastatingly effective, service for a fee. They would guide Jewish immigrants through the complex, often intimidating, process of applying for citizenship. It was a cruel irony. This act of helping others assimilate into a system they themselves were actively subverting. This period was crucial, for it was here that Luciano forged his core philosophy, a doctrine that would forever separate him from the old world, mustache pietis, of the previous generation. He saw the petty tribalism of the Italians, the Irish, and the Jews as a weakness, a sentimental relic. In the cold, hard calculus of profit, ethnicity was irrelevant. Talent and loyalty were the only currencies that mattered. This was the birth of his vision for a national, multicultural syndicate, a vision he and Lansky would nurture in their late night talks on tenement stoops, their breath misting in the cold air as they plotted a future that would eclipse the narrow ambitions of their elders. He was no longer Salvatore Lucania, the poor Sicilian immigrant. He was Charlie Lucky, a name he adopted, some say, from his early success in a dice game, but which more accurately reflected the almost preternatural survival instinct that would come to define his entire criminal career. This instinct was first truly tested not in a boardroom, but in a dark alley, where he was ambushed by 3 rival thugs, beaten, stabbed, and left for dead with his throat slashed from ear to ear. He was found, nearly bled out, and miraculously survived, the jagged scar across his neck becoming a permanent, gruesome trophy of his resilience, a daily reminder that in his world there was no room for sentiment, no space for error, and that luck was not a gift, but a weapon to be seized. The brutal alleyway ambush that left Charles lucky, Luciano with a slashed throat and a newfound cynicism did not mark an end, but rather a violent and definitive beginning. His survival was not interpreted by the underworld as a fluke, but as a sign of a preordained, ruthless destiny. The scar a raw, pink line that would forever distort his voice into a low, gravelly rasp became his brand, a permanent advertisement of his toughness and his seemingly charmed life. This event catalyzed his transition from a promising street-level operator to a serious, strategic force within the criminal fraternity. He understood that individual bravery or a capacity for violence was not enough. True power lay in organization, in leverage, and in the cold, impersonal application of force. He began his ascent by aligning himself with one of the most powerful criminal figures of the era, Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Mafia, the head of a sprawling and powerful Italian crime family. Mafia was a classic, Mustache Pete, a man of immense appetite, both for food and for power, steeped in the old Sicilian traditions of honor, omerta, and absolute loyalty. Luciano served him, but from the very beginning, he did so with a quiet contempt for the boss's archaic methods. He saw Mafia's parochialism, his refusal to work with non-Italians, as a profound strategic blunder. While Mafia was fighting a bloody and pointless war against a rival faction led by Salvatore Maranzano over the nebulous title of Capo di tutti capi, or boss of all bosses, Luciano was building his own parallel empire. With Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, he established the Bugs and Meyer mob, a highly efficient, multi-ethnic crew that specialized in car theft, gambling, and protection, operating with a corporate discipline that was unheard of at the time. This was Luciano's laboratory, where he tested his theories of organizational structure. He recognized that the future of large-scale crime was not in territorial squabbles in Little Italy, but in the burgeoning, multi-billion-dollar industries that Prohibition had just inadvertently created. The Volstead Act of 1920, which outlawed the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages, was not a law to Luciano. It was a business license, a divine intervention that created a demand so vast and so universal that only a truly modern corporation could hope to meet it. He plunged into bootlegging with a visionary's zeal, understanding that this was the engine that would fund his ultimate ambition. He, Lansky, and Siegel began by hijacking the liquor shipments of others, but quickly graduated to managing their own supply lines, running rum from the Caribbean, whiskey from Canada, and operating clandestine distilleries hidden in industrial sections of Brooklyn and New Jersey. The the profits were astronomical, dwarfing anything that could be earned from traditional street crime. This new wealth allowed Luciano to expand his influence, bribing police officers, politicians, and judges on a scale that was previously unimaginable. He bought himself a new identity, trading the rough wool of his youth for impeccably tailored English suits, silk ties, and a quiet, almost menacing demeanor that commanded respect without the need for bluster. He was no longer a gangster. He was an executive, and his business was satisfying the thirst of a nation. Yet, he was still nominally loyal to Joe Masiria, a loyalty that was becoming increasingly strained as the Castellammarese War, the bloody conflict between Masiria and Maranzano, escalated, costing lives and, more importantly, interrupting business. Luciano watched with growing impatience as these two old, world dinosaurs clashed in a war he considered obsolete, a destructive and expensive distraction from the real work of building a stable, profitable, national criminal syndicate. He knew that for his vision to be realized, both of these relics had to go. The stage was set for the most audacious act of corporate treachery in the history of American crime. A move that would not just change the leadership, but would fundamentally reinvent the entire structure of the underworld, transforming it from a collection of feuding tribes into a centralized, boardroom-run conglomerate, the Castellammarese War. A bloody and protracted conflict that stained the early 1930s with the relentless violence of ambushes and retaliatory hits was, in Luciano's meticulous mind, not a war to be won, but a problem to be solved with maximum efficiency and minimal sentiment. He saw the two aging chieftains, Giuseppe Masiria and Salvatore Maranzano, as obsolete operating systems, their codes corrupted by outdated notions of honor and tribal supremacy, crashing against the new hardware of modern, profit-driven ambition. Luciano understood that the path to true power did not lie in defeating one to empower the other. It lay in the systematic elimination of both, thereby creating a vacuum that he and his forward-thinking associates could fill with a new, more resilient structure. His first move was one of breathtaking duplicity, a masterclass in corporate espionage long before the term existed in legitimate business schools. He entered into secret negotiations with Maranzano, the very man his boss Masiria was fighting to the death. In a clandestine meeting, Luciano laid out his proposition. He would deliver the head of Joe Masiria, and in return, Maranzano would end the war and, presumably, reward Luciano with a position of significant power. Maranzano, an erudite man who fancied himself a student of Julius Caesar, agreed, likely believing he was manipulating the young upstart. But Luciano was playing a deeper game. He was not swapping one master for another. He was clearing the board. The plan was set for April 15, 1931. Luciano lured Joe the boss to a leisurely lunch at a Coney Island restaurant called Nuova Villa Tamaro, a place Masiria trusted. They ate a long, multi-course meal, a final communion of boss and underboss. After the plates were cleared, Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. At that moment, 4 men, allegedly Bugsy Siegel, Joe Adonis, Albert Anastasia, and Vito Genovese, walked into the dining room, and opened fire on Giuseppe Masseria, killing him instantly. The newspapers reported that Masseria was found dead, with a single ace of spades clutched in his hand, a theatrical touch that would become a signature of the new era's symbolism. With Masseria gone, Salvatore Maranzano declared himself the capo di tutti capi, and to consolidate his power, he convened a meeting of hundreds of mobsters in a grand hall on the Bronx's Pelham Parkway. It was here that Maranzano, in a move mimicking ancient Roman emperors, announced the formal structure of the 5 families of New York, a move meant to bring order and clearly defined territories. He appointed the heads of these families Luciano, Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, Joe Bonanno, and Tommy Gigliano. For a brief moment, it seemed like peace had been achieved, but Luciano and Lansky, ever the strategists, knew that Maranzano was an even greater threat than Masseria had been. Maranzano was not a crude thug. He was an intellectual who understood the value of structure, but his vision was still rooted in the past, in a hierarchy that placed him at the unassailable pinnacle. Furthermore, they learned through their intricate network of informants that Maranzano, growing paranoid of Luciano's modernizing influence and his close ties to non-Italian allies like Lansky, had contracted a team of Irish hitmen from the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood to assassinate both Luciano and Genovese. The old world was once again trying to strangle the new in its cradle, but Luciano and Lansky moved with a speed and precision that Maranzano, for all his classical education, could not comprehend. They decided to strike first, turning Maranzano's own plot against him. On September 10, 1931, just a few months after Masseria's murder, a group of men posing as government tax agents entered Maranzano's offices in the New York Central Building. Their leader was a man known for his chilling efficiency, a man who would become one of Luciano's most feared instruments of corporate policy, Samuel Red Levine, while Levine and his team disarmed Maranzano's bodyguards. Another team, allegedly including Bugsy Siegel, stood ready as backup. Maranzano, realizing the ruse, fought back. But he was no match for the professionalism of the killers. He was stabbed multiple times and shot. His body left in his opulent office a stark message that the era of the boss of all bosses was over. This single day, September 10, 1931, would later be immortalized by the press as the Night of the Sicilian Vespers, a bloody purge that saw the elimination of dozens of old guard Mafia leaders across the country. It was not merely a change of leadership, it was a revolution, a hostile takeover that cleared the way for Luciano's most brilliant and enduring innovation, the Commission. With the chessboard cleared of the 2 reigning kings, Charles, Lucky, Luciano, now the undisputed master of the game, could finally begin the work of building his corporate empire in earnest. The old feudal system, with its single, vulnerable head, had been proven catastrophically flawed. In its place, Luciano envisioned a board of directors, a collaborative, yet ruthlessly efficient, governing body that would oversee the vast and varied interests of organized crime in America. This was the birth of the Commission, arguably Luciano's most significant and enduring legacy. An innovation that would transform the American underworld from a chaotic collection of warring tribes into a sleek, sophisticated, and shockingly stable multinational corporation. The Commission was, in essence, a criminal United Nations, a central committee designed to mediate disputes, enforce agreements, approve new memberships, and sanction high-level hits, thereby preventing the kind of all-out war that had just consumed Masseria and Maranzano. Its founding members were the heads of the 5 families of New York. Luciano's own family, now under his direct command, alongside those of Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, Joe Bonanno, and Tommy Gigliano. But in a radical break from tradition, Luciano insisted on including 2 powerful non-Italian partners, Meyer Lansky, his lifelong friend and financial strategist, and Bugsy Siegel, representing their burgeoning West Coast interests. Furthermore, he extended membership to the powerful crime syndicates from other cities, most notably Al Capone's Chicago outfit and the criminal family from Buffalo. This was a monumental shift, a formal acknowledgement that profit superseded ethnicity, that business was business. The Commission established a set of bylaws, a constitution for the underworld. It outlawed the unsanctioned killing of any made member, ensuring that hits were not acts of passion, but calculated corporate decisions. It created protocols for initiating new members and defined territories for various criminal enterprises, from gambling and loan sharking to labor racketeering and narcotics. Under this new, stable structure, Luciano's empire flourished with an efficiency that would be the envy of any Fortune 500 company. He systemized the national numbers racket, creating a lottery that preyed on the hopes of the poor in every major city. He consolidated control over the garment industry, from the truckers who moved the goods to the unions that represented the workers, ensuring a steady stream of revenue through a sophisticated blend of coercion and corruption. His prostitution ring, however, would become the most extensive and, ultimately, the most notorious of his ventures. Unlike the scattered, disorganized streetwalking of the past, Luciano's operation was a model of vertical integration. He established a centralized booking system, complete with a network of call houses and a rotation of women who were moved between cities to avoid the attention of local vice squads. He even provided standardized medical care for them, not out of any sense of compassion, but to protect his assets from disease and maintain a consistent, marketable product. The profits were staggering, funneled through a web of front businesses and into legitimate investments, all meticulously managed by the brilliant mind of Meyer Lansky. Luciano himself became a phantom, a ghost in the machine. He operated from a suite of unmarked offices, conducted meetings in the back rooms of anonymous restaurants, and was never seen in public with his underlings. He lived a life of curated luxury, residing in a lavish suite at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel under the alias Charles Ross, enjoying the finest clothes, cars, and women, all while remaining utterly untouchable by conventional law enforcement. The police and the district attorneys knew he was the mastermind, but they could never gather enough evidence to make a charge stick. He had become a myth, a whispered name. the architect of a shadow government that operated in perfect parallel to the legitimate one, often with more discipline and far greater profits. This was the pinnacle of his power, the full realization of the vision he and Lansky had sketched out on those tenement stoops decades earlier. He had not just joined the underworld, he had re-engineered it, building a self-regulating, self-perpetuating entity that was designed to survive long after its founder was gone. But this very success, this vast, intricate web of corruption and control, would also create the vulnerabilities that his enemies, both within the organization and outside it, would soon exploit. The higher he climbed, the more visible he became, and the ground beneath his feet was about to be shaken by a relentless, puritanical force who saw Luciano not as a criminal mastermind, but as the ultimate symbol of the moral decay he had sworn to eradicate. The force that would eventually threaten to dismantle Charles Luciano's meticulously constructed empire was not a rival gangster or a corrupt politician on his payroll, but a single, incorruptible, and fanatically determined man, New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey, appointed as a special prosecutor in 1935 with a specific mandate to clean up the city's rampant vice and corruption. Dewey was the antithesis of everything Luciano represented. He was a product of the American elite, a graduate of the University of Michigan and Columbia Law School, a man whose ambition was as vast as Luciano's, but channeled through the rigid corridors of legal authority. Dewey understood that to convict a phantom, he could not attack the entire structure. He had to find a single, vulnerable thread and pull until the entire tapestry unraveled. He chose, with brilliant and ruthless insight, the one aspect of Luciano's vast portfolio that was both highly visible and carried a deep social stigma: organized prostitution. While bootlegging had a certain romantic, rebellious allure in the public imagination, the large-scale exploitation of women was a crime that stirred moral outrage and could galvanize a jury. Dewey's strategy was a masterclass in legal pressure. His team began a sweeping, relentless raid on brothels across the city, arresting hundreds of sex workers, madams, and low-level bookers. They were not after these small fish. They were using them as bait to hook the bigger ones. Dewey's investigators employed a simple, brutal formula: isolation and intimidation. They separated the women, held them incommunicado, and subjected them to grueling, repetitive interrogations, promising them immunity or reduced sentences if they cooperated, and threatening them with decades in prison if they did not. They exploited the inherent instability and jealousy within the criminal world, turning low-level operators against their superiors. The key break came when they managed to flip a handful of crucial witnesses, including a madam named Nancy Presser and a booker named Pete Harris, who provided the first concrete links between the day-to-day operations of the call, girl ring, and the man at the very top. They described a system that was, as Dewey had suspected, run with corporate efficiency, with Luciano as its unseen CEO, receiving regular financial reports and settling territorial disputes. Dewey then orchestrated a series of dramatic, well-publicized arrests. On the night of April 1, 1936, Luciano was tracked to a private party in Hot Springs, Arkansas, a town whose police chief was famously in the pocket of the mob. Dewey's agents, operating outside their jurisdiction, had to literally snatch Luciano from the custody of local police who were attempting to protect him. He was extradited to New York and thrown into the Tombs, the city's infamous prison, a humiliating fall from his Waldorf Astoria suite. The trial that followed was a media circus, dubbed the trial of the century. Dewey, a master of courtroom theater, meticulously presented his case, painting Luciano not as a sophisticated businessman, but as a vicious predator who personally beat women and profited from human misery. The defense, led by a team of high-priced attorneys, argued that Luciano was too smart, too rich, to be involved in something as sordid as a prostitution ring, that he was a gambler and a bootlegger, but not a pimp. They attempted to discredit the witnesses, highlighting their criminal records and the deals they had struck with the prosecution. But Dewey's narrative was too powerful, his evidence too voluminous. The sheer scale of the operation, the detailed financial records, and the relentless testimony of over 60 witnesses created an undeniable picture of a vast criminal enterprise directed by Luciano. After nearly 12 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. On June 18, 1936, standing before a stoic Judge Philip J. McCook, Charles Lucky, Luciano, the man who had reorganized the American underworld, was sentenced to a staggering 30 to 50 years in prison, a term that was widely seen as a de facto life sentence. For Thomas E. Dewey, it was the crowning achievement that would propel him to the governorship of New York and 2 failed bids for the presidency. For the public, it was a triumph of justice. But for Luciano and his associates, it was not an end. It was merely a corporate reorganization. From his cell in Dannemora prison, the Siberia of the New York penal system, Luciano, through a network of corrupt guards and visiting attorneys, continued to run his empire, with Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello acting as his chief executive officers on the outside. The commission continued to meet, profits continued to flow, and Luciano waited with the same patience he had shown in his rise to power for an opportunity, for a twist of fate that could spring him from his concrete cage. That opportunity would arrive not from the criminal underworld, but from the cataclysmic global event of World War II, and it would involve the very nation whose shores he had left as a child. The outbreak of World War II created a paradox for the American government, a problem so immense and unconventional that it would force them to look for solutions in the most unorthodox of places, including a maximum security prison cell. As the United States mobilized for war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the nation's ports, particularly the sprawling, chaotic waterfront of New York City, became the single most critical artery for the war effort. Millions of tons of troops, equipment, and supplies flowed through these docks, making them a tantalizing target for Nazi sabotage. The Office of Naval Intelligence, or ONI, faced a seemingly insurmountable challenge. The longshoremen's unions were notoriously corrupt and infiltrated by the mob, and the dock workers themselves, a close-knit, suspicious community, were impervious to traditional law enforcement. The government knew that saboteurs could easily blend in, and a single well-placed explosive device on a munitions ship could cripple the entire East Coast supply chain. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that a bold and controversial plan was conceived, a plan that would require making a deal with the devil himself. Commander Charles R. Haffenden of the ON, operating out of his 3rd Naval District headquarters in New York, began to explore the unthinkable, enlisting the help of the one organization that had absolute control over the waterfront, the Luciano crime family. The initial contacts were made through a series of clandestine meetings with Joseph Socks Lanza, the mob's brutal boss of the Fulton Fish Market, and through him with Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello. The proposition was simple. In exchange for his help, Luciano would receive favorable consideration for a pardon or early release. The details of this arrangement remain shrouded in official secrecy, with many documents later destroyed or heavily redacted, but the broad strokes are clear. From his cell in Great Meadow Correctional Facility, to which he had been transferred from Dannemora, Luciano agreed to cooperate. He issued orders, passed through his lawyers and Lansky, to his vast network on the docks. His men were to become the unofficial eyes and ears of the Navy. Longshoremen were instructed to report any suspicious activity, any unfamiliar faces asking strange questions about ship movements or cargo. Union bosses ensured that their members remained vigilant and, crucially, did not engage in any strikes or labor unrest that could hamper the war effort. The mob's iron-fisted control, once a source of civic corruption, was now being leveraged for national security. The operation, codenamed Operation Underworld, yielded tangible results. The ONN reported that the flow of information from the docks increased dramatically, and while no major Nazi sabotage plots were ever definitively uncovered and foiled on the New York docks, the intelligence provided was considered invaluable by the Navy. The collaboration, however, did not end there, as the Allies planned their invasion of Sicily in 1943, codenamed Operation Husky. Luciano's knowledge once again became an asset. Having been born in the Sicilian town of Lercara Fritti, and with his extensive network of contacts still active throughout the island, he was able to provide military planners with detailed maps, information about local terrain, harbor depths, and the sentiments of the local population towards the invading forces. He even used his influence to facilitate contacts with the Sicilian Mafia, who, having been brutally suppressed by Mussolini's fascist regime, were more than willing to assist the Americans in ousting the dictator, acting as guides and informants for the advancing troops. The success of this collaboration created an immense moral and political debt. When the war ended in 1945, Meyer Lansky and Moses Polikoff, Luciano's lawyer, began a quiet but relentless campaign to collect on that debt. They petitioned the New York State Parole Board, arguing that Luciano's patriotic service had earned him his freedom. The board was flooded with supportive, albeit secret, testimonials from naval intelligence officers, The most powerful voice in favor of commutation was, ironically, that of Thomas E. Dewey, who was now the governor of New York. The man who had put Luciano away was now faced with the overwhelming evidence of his wartime contribution and the political pragmatism of the moment, inclined to set him free. Dewey, however, would not grant a full pardon, which would have absolved Luciano of his guilt. Instead, on January 3, 1946, as a reward for his exceptional, significant, and material aid to the war effort, Governor Dewey commuted Luciano's sentence on the condition that he would not contest his deportation to Italy, the country of his birth, which he had left as a small child. Luciano was released from prison, immediately taken into custody by federal immigration agents, and placed on a cargo ship, the Laura Keene, bound for Naples. He was free, but he was being exiled, cast out from the empire he had built from the ground up, forced to watch from across the ocean as others managed his creation. He was leaving America, but he had no intention of retiring. The man who disembarked from the Laura Keene in Naples in February of 1946 was a ghost, a legend forced back into the shell of a mortal man, returning to a homeland that was more foreign to him than the streets of New York had ever been. Charles Lucky, Luciano, now 48 years old, found himself in an Italy shattered by war, a landscape of rubble and desperation that stood in stark contrast to the vibrant, booming America he had been forced to leave behind. He was met with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion by the Italian authorities, who provided him with a modest stipend and instructed him to reside in the impoverished city of Naples, far from his native Sicily, where they feared his presence would galvanize the local Mafia. For a short while, Luciano played the part of the weary, retired exile. He was photographed sipping espresso in cafes, strolling along the waterfront, and expressing a desire for a quiet life. But this performance was a facade, a strategic feint designed to lull his watchers into a false sense of security. The fire of ambition had not been extinguished by a decade in prison. It had only been banked, waiting for oxygen. Luciano's mind, the same mind that had engineered the commission, could not accept the role of a passive observer. He quickly assessed the post-war Italian landscape and saw not destruction, but opportunity. The country was a vacuum, its economy in tatters, its institutions weak, and its people desperate for any means of survival. Furthermore, the Allied occupation, in which he had played a covert role, had inadvertently empowered the very Sicilian Mafia families that Mussolini had tried to crush, using them as a bulwark against the rising tide of communism. Luciano recognized that he was uniquely positioned to become the critical link between the old world and the new. He began to quietly establish his network, meeting with shadowy figures from the Sicilian clans, many of whom remembered his family or were in awe of his American reputation. He understood that his greatest asset was his connection to the American Commission, the very organization he had created. He positioned himself not as a competitor to the Italian families, but as a facilitator, a global ambassador of crime. His first and most lucrative enterprise became the re-establishment and massive expansion of the international heroin trade. Using his contacts in New York, particularly through Vito Genovese, who was himself hiding out in Italy, Luciano helped orchestrate a pipeline that would become known as the French Connection. Raw opium would be sourced from Turkey, processed into morphine base, and then heroin in clandestine laboratories in Marseille, France, and then shipped across the Atlantic to the vast American market, hidden in the cargo holds of ships whose crews were controlled by his waterfront unions. This operation required a level of international coordination that only Luciano could provide, brokering peace between rival Corsican, Sicilian, and American gangs and ensuring the smooth, secure transit of the product from one continent to another. The profits were beyond anything he had seen during Prohibition, and they were used to fund a life of renewed, if distant, power. He bought a luxurious villa, invested in legitimate businesses as a front, and was frequently seen in the company of beautiful women and powerful men. But his ambitions stretched beyond narcotics. His gaze turned longingly across the Atlantic to another potential paradise for his kind of enterprise, Cuba. The island, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida, was a playground for the American elite, a wide open territory run by a corrupt and malleable government. It was, in Luciano's eyes, the perfect bridge, a neutral ground from which he could effectively resume command of his American empire without technically violating the terms of his deportation. Meyer Lansky was already deeply entrenched in Havana, operating casinos and hotels in partnership with the Cuban dictator, Fulgencio Batista. The plan was audacious. Luciano would move to Havana and from there preside over a summit of the American mob, a gathering that would reaffirm his authority and plot the future of their collective enterprises. In October 1946, using a forged passport and a circuitous route that took him from Rome to Caracas, Venezuela, Luciano finally arrived in Havana. He was back in the Americas, and for a few brief, glorious months, it seemed as if the king had returned. He held court at the Hotel National, meeting with the who's who of the American underworld: Lansky, Siegel, Costello, Genovese, and Accardo. This Havana conference was meant to be his triumphant reinstatement, the moment he transitioned from an exiled founder to an active chairman of the board. But the very visibility of this gathering, the sheer audacity of it, would prove to be his undoing. He had underestimated the relentless scrutiny of his enemies and the power of the press. His carefully constructed bridge was about to be burned from both ends, forcing him into a final, permanent exile from the world he had worked so hard to create. The Havana Conference of 1946 was the apogee of Charles Luciano's post-war influence, a glittering, shadowy coronation that simultaneously represented the peak of his audacity and the seed of his final downfall. For several weeks, the Hotel National in Havana was transformed into the unofficial capital of the underworld, its luxurious suites and casino floors buzzing with the quiet, intense conversations of men who controlled millions of dollars and thousands of lives. The agenda was vast and ambitious, reflecting the global reach of the syndicate Luciano had built. Key items included the formal division of the burgeoning international heroin trade, with Luciano solidifying his role as the primary link between the Sicilian suppliers and the American distributors. There were reports to be heard on the state of the various families, territorial disputes to be adjudicated, and new investments to be approved. One of the most fateful discussions centered on the West Coast operations of Bugsy Siegel, who was presenting his grandiose and catastrophically over-budget vision for the Flamingo Hotel and Casino in the nascent desert oasis of Las Vegas. Siegel, desperate for more funding, faced skeptical, hard-nosed investors like Meyer Lansky, who saw the project not as a vision, but as a bottomless pit swallowing their money. Luciano, ever the strategist, likely understood the potential of Las Vegas, but the tension in the room was palpable, a crack in the unified facade of the commission. Another critical matter was the unresolved status of Vito Genovese, who had been hiding in Italy from a murder charge in the United States. With that charge now mysteriously falling apart due to the disappearance of a key witness, Genovese was preparing to return to New York, a move that threatened the delicate power balance Luciano had established, with Frank Costello effectively running the family in his stead. Throughout it all, Luciano presided with an air of calm authority, the respected elder statesman whose wisdom was sought on every major decision. He was photographed, tanned and relaxed in white suits, attending nightclubs and racetracks, embodying the very public image of a successful, retired businessman on holiday. But this very visibility was a catastrophic miscalculation. Luciano had believed that the Cuban authorities, thoroughly corrupted by Batista and Lansky's payments, could shield him from American scrutiny. He was wrong. The gathering of so many infamous American mobsters in one place did not go unnoticed. The American press, particularly the influential columnist Robert Roark, got wind of the conference and published sensational stories about the mob summit in Havana, naming Luciano as the guest of honor. The headlines created a firestorm of public outrage and political embarrassment. In Washington, the irascible and fiercely moralistic director of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Harry J. Anslinger, was apoplectic. Anslinger had long considered Luciano his white whale, the kingpin of the global drug trade that his agency was sworn to destroy. The news that Luciano was not in Italy, but was instead holding court just a short flight from Florida, was a direct and brazen challenge to his authority. Anslinger launched into immediate and furious action. He brought immense pressure to bear on the Truman administration, which in turn delivered an ultimatum to the Batista government: expel Luciano immediately or face severe consequences, including the immediate embargo of all medical shipments to Cuba, a devastating threat in the post-war era. Batista, whose corruption had its limits, when faced with such direct and damaging pressure from the American colossus, had no choice. The party was over. Just as Luciano was beginning to feel the reins of power back in his hands, they were brutally snatched away. Cuban police politely but firmly informed him that he was no longer welcome. In March of 1947, a mere 6 months after his triumphant arrival, a defeated and furious Luciano was once again placed on a ship, this time the SS Bakir, and forcibly returned to Italy. This second exile was fundamentally different from the first. The Havana debacle had exposed his limitations and emboldened his enemies within the organization. The bridge to America had not just been closed, it had been demolished by the very government he had once helped. And his dream of ruling his empire from a sunny, neutral headquarters was shattered forever. He was now truly a man without a country, confined to Italy, a place he still considered a prison, while his life's work was managed and increasingly usurped by others an ocean away. The king was off the board, and the pawns were beginning to make their own moves. The final, irrevocable collapse of Charles Luciano's dream to establish his command from Havana cast a long, permanent shadow over the remainder of his life, transforming his existence in Italy from a strategic posting into a gilded cage from which he could only watch as the empire he architected evolved, fractured, and began to forget its founder. Forced back onto Italian soil in 1947, he was now a marked man, subjected to intense and relentless surveillance by the Italian police, who were themselves under growing pressure from Harry Anslinger's Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Anslinger, a man of puritanical zeal and deep personal vendettas, had made the destruction of Luciano his life's mission. Convinced that he was the mastermind behind a tidal wave of heroin that was beginning to flood American cities. Luciano's every move was monitored. His phone lines were tapped, his mail was intercepted, and his visitors were photographed and identified. This constant scrutiny severely hampered his ability to conduct business with the efficiency he was once known for. He could no longer be the active CEO. He was reduced to a consultant, a founding partner whose advice was sometimes sought, but increasingly ignored by the new generation of leaders back in America. The balance of power was shifting dramatically. Vito Genovese, now back in New York and immune from prosecution, began a ruthless and systematic campaign to consolidate his own power, a campaign that directly threatened Luciano's legacy. Genovese was a throwback to the old ways, paranoid, greedy, and hungry for the singular title of Capo di Tutti Capi that Luciano's commission had been designed to abolish. He saw Luciano's exile not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity to eliminate his rivals and seize control. Genovese orchestrated one of the most shocking events in American criminal history, the infamous assassination attempt on Frank Costello in May 1957, which Costello miraculously survived, and the brutal murder of Albert Anastasia, the ruthless boss of what would become the Gambino family, as he sat in a barber's chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in October of that same year. These attacks were a direct assault on the Luciano, Costello, Lansky axis of power, a declaration of war against the more corporate, business-oriented model in favor of a return to violent, top-down rule. The culmination of this power struggle was the infamous Appalachian meeting in November 1957, where Genovese summoned over 100 mob bosses from across the United States to his estate in upstate New York to anoint himself as the new supreme leader. The meeting was a catastrophic failure, broken up by a suspicious New York State police trooper, leading to dozens of high-profile arrests and exposing the existence of the national crime syndicate to the American public in a way that no Senate hearing ever had. For Luciano, watching from afar, the Appalachian fiasco was the ultimate betrayal of his vision. The commission he had created to prevent such messy, public wars for supremacy had failed in its primary purpose. His creation was being torn apart from within by the very forces of greed and ambition he had tried to institutionalize. His influence was waning, and his sources of income were becoming less reliable. While he still received tribute from some operations, particularly the heroin trade, the golden pipeline of the French Connection was becoming riskier and more contested. He lived comfortably in a Naples apartment, but the vast wealth and absolute authority he had once known were ghosts of the past. He spent his days granting interviews to writers, often spinning a self-serving narrative of his life, portraying himself as a misunderstood businessman and a patriot, while vehemently denying any involvement in the narcotics trade, despite all evidence to the contrary. He became a tourist attraction, a living legend that visitors to Naples would sometimes spot, a relic from a bygone era. The fire that had once driven him to reorganize the underworld was now dimmed, replaced by a simmering resentment and a profound sense of irrelevance. The world was moving on. The Kefauver Committee hearings in the early 1950s had already brought the reality of organized crime into American living rooms, and the Appalachian debacle had cemented it in the public consciousness. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, who had long denied the existence of a national mafia, was now forced to take it seriously. The golden age of the mob, the age that Luciano had personally designed, was coming to an end, not with a bang, but with a series of stuttering, chaotic convulsions. And Luciano, the architect, was powerless to stop it, a king without a kingdom, a general whose army was now fighting a civil war under a flag he no longer recognized. The final, quiet act of his life was approaching, an end as strangely anticlimactic as his later years had been, yet one that would still be shrouded in the mystery and intrigue that had defined his entire existence. The final years of Charles, Lucky, Luciano were a study in quiet, agonizing irrelevance, a slow, motion descent from the pinnacle of global power to the mundane anxieties of a man whose name was still feared, but whose commands no longer echoed across the ocean with their former authority. Confined to Italy, he became a prisoner of his own legend, a statue upon a pedestal that everyone admired but no one consulted. The world he watched from his Naples apartment was changing at a dizzying pace, and the criminal empire he had built was transforming into something he barely recognized, something coarser, more volatile, and ultimately less disciplined. The Appalachian meeting had been a humiliation from which the commission never fully recovered, exposing its inner workings to law enforcement and the public alike, and shattering the carefully maintained veil of secrecy that was essential to its operation. In America, a new generation was rising. Men who had heard the stories of Luciano's brilliance but felt no personal loyalty to the exiled founder. They were more concerned with their own territorial squabbles and the immense profits from narcotics, a trade Luciano publicly denounced even as he privately benefited from its infrastructure. His primary link to his former life, Meyer Lansky, remained in contact, but their conversations were now more nostalgic than strategic, reminiscing about the old days on the Lower East Side rather than planning future conquests. Lansky himself was facing his own challenges. With the Cuban Revolution in 1959, led by Fidel Castro, seizing his lucrative casinos and hotels, wiping out tens of millions of dollars in assets, and closing another critical door for the mob's international operations. For Luciano, this was another nail in the coffin of his global vision. The Havana gateway was now permanently sealed, and with it died his last, best hope of ever establishing a physical foothold in the Americas. His life in Naples was a strange parody of his former existence. He was wealthy enough to live comfortably, but he was constantly watched, his phone bugged, his movements tracked by both the Italian police and agents of the American Federal Bureau of Narcotics. He dined at fine restaurants, held court at the Gambrinus Cafe, and was occasionally seen with film producers, spinning fantasies about a biopic that would tell his side of the story. He granted interviews to journalists, carefully curating his legacy, portraying himself as a reformer who had brought order to chaos and a patriot who had answered his country's call in its hour of need. He spoke of his conviction for compulsory prostitution with a lingering, bitter outrage, insisting it was a frame up by the ambitious Thomas Dewey, a narrative that contained a kernel of truth but ignored the vast, brutal reality of his criminal enterprise. He was, in many ways, writing his own obituary, trying to shape how history would remember him. But beneath the carefully managed exterior, there was a deep and profound loneliness. He spoke often of New York, of the energy of Broadway, the familiar sights and sounds of a city that was his true home. He missed the deference, the unspoken power that came with a mere glance from him in a restaurant, the knowledge that he was the most important man in the room. In Italy, he was a novelty, a famous American gangster, but he was not feared, not in the way that truly mattered. The stream of visiting acolytes and associates had slowed to a trickle. The flow of tribute money became less consistent as his power waned. He began to think about his mortality, about his legacy. He had never married, had no children to carry on his name. His empire, his life's work, was his only progeny, and it was being mismanaged, corrupted, and torn apart by lesser men. He saw the rise of Vito Genovese, a man he considered a treacherous and short-sighted thug, and it pained him to see his corporate model being replaced by a more primitive, violent dictatorship. He saw the headlines about growing drug addiction in American cities and knew that his own early involvement in that trade had helped plant the seeds for this social catastrophe, even if he now publicly claimed to oppose it. The weight of his own creation was pressing down on him, and there was no one left, not even the brilliant Meyer Lansky, who could help him bear it. The end, when it came, was as sudden and mysterious as so many other events in his life. A final moment that would ensure the name Lucky Luciano would be shrouded in controversy and speculation until the very end and beyond. The end for Charles Lucky Luciano arrived not in a hail of bullets. The fate he had orchestrated for so many others, but in the mundane setting of a Naples airport, a place of transit that symbolized the perpetual state of limbo that had defined his last 15 years. It was January 26, 1962, and Luciano, now 64 years old, had driven to the Capodichino airport to meet with a Hollywood film producer named Martin Gosch, who was interested in making a movie based on his life. Gosch would later claim, in a controversial and heavily disputed account, that Luciano was there to approve a final screenplay, a project that the aging gangster saw as his last chance to cement his legacy in the public imagination. The meeting took place, and according to Gosch, they discussed the script, with Luciano making notes and suggestions, still trying to control the narrative of his own story from beyond the grave. After the business was concluded, Luciano, perhaps feeling a sense of closure, or perhaps simply wary, walked through the terminal. It was then that he collapsed. The official cause of death was listed as a massive heart attack, a sudden and catastrophic failure of the organ that had driven his relentless ambition for so many decades. The man who had survived a slit throat, countless gang wars, and a decade in America's toughest prisons was ultimately felled by the most common of killers. The news of his death reverberated across the Atlantic, making front pages in New York and prompting a complex mixture of reactions from the underworld he had created. Some, like Meyer Lansky, were said to have been genuinely grief-stricken, mourning the loss of a friend and a strategic partner of nearly 50 years. Others, like Vito Genovese, who was himself languishing in an Atlanta federal prison on a narcotics conviction, likely saw it as the final removal of a rival, a symbolic passing of the torch, even if that torch was now burning in a prison cell. But the circumstances of Luciano's death were almost immediately shrouded in the same mystery that had surrounded his life. There were persistent and never proven rumors that he had been assassinated, that his heart attack had been induced. Some speculated that Genovese, even from prison, had ordered a final hit to eliminate any lingering sentimental loyalty to the old boss. Others pointed a finger at the Corsican drug lords he had partnered with, suggesting a falling out over the immense profits of the heroin trade. Another theory, more symbolic than practical, suggested that the commission itself had sanctioned his death, not for any specific transgression, but as a final, clean break from the past, a way to sever the last connection to the founding era and fully embrace the new, more chaotic world they now inhabited. The most compelling theory, however, and one that speaks to the enduring nature of his influence, was that he was poisoned by agents of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Director Harry Anslinger had loathed Luciano with a pathological intensity, and the thought of the gangster profiting from a Hollywood film that glorified his life was likely an unbearable prospect. While no concrete evidence has ever emerged to support this claim, it persists as a testament to the shadow war that had been waged between the two men for decades. The truth of his final moments likely died with him, a final, fitting enigma for a man who had always operated in the spaces between fact and legend. His body was prepared for burial, and the question of his final resting place became an international issue. The American government made it clear that his body would not be allowed back into the United States, a final, posthumous reaffirmation of his exile. Italy, his official homeland, was the only option. A funeral was held in Naples, and in a poignant display of his faded power, only a handful of mourners attended. The great bosses of America, the men who owed their positions to the structure he invented, did not make the journey. They sent flowers and telegrams, safe, symbolic gestures that cost them nothing. The man who had once commanded a nation-wide criminal corporation was laid to rest in a private crypt in Steen. John's Cemetery in Naples, a world away from the New York streets where his legend had been born. In a final, bitter irony, his body would later be moved to a more public and less prestigious section of the cemetery, a neglect that stood in stark contrast to the lavish, heavily attended funerals of mob bosses in New York. It was as if, in death, the world was already forgetting the specifics of the man, remembering only the myth, the name, Lucky Luciano, while the complex, brilliant, and ruthless individual behind it faded into the historical shadows, his grave a quiet, overlooked monument to a seismic shift in the underworld that would continue to ripple through society for generations to come. The death of Charles Lucky Luciano did not, as some might have expected, signal the collapse of the empire he had so meticulously architected. Instead, it revealed the terrifying resilience and frightening adaptability of the corporate model he had imposed upon the American underworld. The commission, though shaken by the Appalachian fiasco and the internal warring that had led to it, endured. It evolved, it adapted to new pressures, and it continued to function as the supreme governing body for organized crime in America for decades, a chilling testament to the brilliance of its initial design. Luciano's true legacy was not a specific criminal enterprise which could be dismantled, but a revolutionary organizational principle that crime could be run not as a series of personal fiefdoms, but as a cold, impersonal, and immensely profitable business. This corporate structure allowed the syndicate to survive the loss of its founder, the imprisonment of subsequent leaders like Vito Genovese and John Gotti, and the relentless pressure from federal agencies that finally, in the latter part of the 20th century, began to score significant victories using laws like the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the Reichso Statute, which allowed prosecutors to go after an entire organization for the crimes of its members, was a legal tool specifically designed to combat the very kind of structured entity Luciano had created. But for nearly 50 years after his exile, the Commission provided stability, resolved disputes, and allocated territories, ensuring that the flow of illicit revenue from gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and later, on a scale he might never have imagined, narcotics, continued almost unabated. his influence also extended geographically in ways he had only begun to explore. The heroin pipeline he helped establish between Sicily and the United States, the famous French connection, flourished long after his death, creating addicts and funding empires on both sides of the ocean. It was only in the early 1970s that concerted international efforts finally disrupted this particular route, but by then, the model had been replicated elsewhere. Furthermore, his early recognition of the potential in Las Vegas, even if he was skeptical of Bugsy Siegel's management, proved prescient. The desert city became the single greatest money laundering machine and source of legitimate looking wealth for the mob for the next 30 years, with Meyer Lansky and others using the skim from casino profits to fund operations and enrich the families back east. The corporate structure Luciano invented allowed for this kind of diversification and long-term investment. It was no longer about a single boss controlling a neighborhood. It was about a board of directors overseeing a national portfolio that included union pension funds, legitimate businesses, casino holdings, and global narcotics trafficking. This institutionalization of crime is perhaps his most profound and damaging legacy. By moving the underworld from a culture of thuggish brutality to one of boardroom efficiency, he made it more insidious, more deeply embedded in the fabric of the economy, and far more difficult to eradicate. The corrupt alliances he forged with politicians, police, and judges became a standard operating procedure, a cost of doing business that subsequent generations of mobsters refined. The political corruption that plagued American cities for much of the 20th century, from the waterfronts to the hallways of City Hall, can be traced directly to the system of institutionalized bribery and influence, peddling that Luciano and his contemporaries perfected. He demonstrated that with enough money and the strategic application of fear, the legal system could not only be circumvented, but could be made to work in your favor. This created a cynicism towards public institutions that still lingers today. On a personal level, Luciano also left behind a new archetype for the gangster. He was not the flamboyant, Tommy, gun-wielding Al Capone, nor was he the rustic tradition-bound Sicilian man of honor. He was the CEO in a tailored suit, the quiet man in the shadows who never raised his voice because he never needed to. He became the model for fictional characters like Michael Corleone in The Godfather, Vito Corleone himself with his focus on strategy and respect over flashy violence, and Hyman Roth in The Godfather Part Zero, a character based directly on Meyer Lansky, who famously tells Michael, "We're bigger than US. Steel." This was the essence of Luciano's vision, the belief that their corporation was more powerful, more resilient, and more profitable than the giants of American industry. He transformed the public perception of the mob from a group of ethnic thugs into a sophisticated, almost admirable, parallel government. This romanticization, this dark allure, is also a part of his enduring legacy, a shadow that he cast over popular culture, which continues to fascinate and horrify the public in equal measure, ensuring that the story of Lucky Luciano, the bicycle killer who became the chairman of the board, would be told and retold long after the man himself had turned to dust. To truly grasp the monumental scale of Charles Luciano's legacy, one must look beyond the immediate aftermath of his death and trace the long, dark shadow his creation cast across the remainder of the 20th century and even into our modern era. A shadow that fell not only on the criminal underworld, but on the very institutions of American democracy and global finance. The Commission, as an idea, proved to be a virus of unparalleled potency, and its strains mutated and adapted to survive every antibiotic the forces of law could develop. In the 1970s and 1980s, the five families of New York, the direct descendants of Luciano's original corporate charter, were at the peak of their power and influence, their tentacles reaching into the heart of the city's economic life. They controlled the concrete and construction industries, dictating which skyscrapers could be built and ensuring that every bag of cement, every steel beam, paid a tax to the syndicate. They held a stranglehold on the garment industry, the trucking unions, the fish market, and the garbage hauling businesses. They infiltrated Wall Street, running sophisticated pump and dump stock schemes through boiler rooms that preyed on small-time investors, a direct application of Luciano's principle that any legitimate industry could be co-opted and milked for illicit profit. The sheer scale of their operation was staggering. It is estimated that at its height, the American Mafia was a multi-billion-dollar-a-year enterprise, a shadow economy that rivaled the GDP of small nations. This was all made possible by the stable dispute resolution mechanism of the Commission, which prevented the kind of all-out war that would have drawn unsustainable heat from law enforcement. However, the very success of this model also contained the seeds of its eventual, though partial, undoing. The immense profits, particularly from the narcotics trade that Luciano had helped systematize, fostered a new generation of leaders who were often more greedy and less disciplined than their predecessors. Men like John Gotti, the Teflon Don of the Gambino family, abandoned the low-profile corporate ethos of Luciano and Costello for a flamboyant, publicity-seeking style that made him a media star, but also a top-tier target for the FBI, the federal government. After decades of playing catch-up, finally developed the legal tools to match Luciano's organizational genius. The Rights-O Act, passed in 1970 but not used effectively against the mob until the 1980s, was the philosophical antithesis of Luciano's corporate charter. It allowed prosecutors to attack the entire organization for the crimes of its members, effectively treating the crime family as a continuing criminal enterprise. This was combined with the revolutionary use of turncoats, made men who violated the oath of Omert that Luciano had once held sacred. The testimony of men like Sammy, the Bull, Gravano, who detailed the inner workings of the Gambino family, and Joe Massino, the first sitting boss of a New York family to become a government witness, led to a cascade of convictions that decapitated the leadership of all five families. By the turn of the 21st century, the American Mafia, as Luciano had known it, was a hollowed out shell of its former self, its leaders in prison, its control over unions and industries largely broken, by relentless federal prosecution. But to declare the death of Luciano's model would be a profound mistake. The principles he pioneered, the corporate structure, the international alliances, the laundering of money through legitimate businesses, the corruption of public officials, did not die with the old Italian-dominated Mafia. They were simply adopted by newer, more diffuse, and in many ways more dangerous criminal organizations. The Russian Vor-Visa-Cone, the Mexican and Colombian cartels, the sprawling triads of Asia, and the global networks of cybercriminals all operate on principles that Luciano would recognize and admire. They form commissions and cartels to set prices and allocate territories for drugs, human trafficking, and arms. They use shell companies and offshore banks to launder money on an industrial scale, a practice Meyer Lansky pioneered, but which has now been perfected with digital currencies and international wire transfers. They corrupt politicians and police forces not just in one city, but in entire nations. The global illicit economy is now estimated to be worth trillions of dollars annually, a dark testament to the scalability of Luciano's original vision. He demonstrated that crime, when properly organized, is not a social ill to be cured, but a multinational industry to be managed. His true, enduring legacy is this paradigm shift. He was the Henry Ford of the underworld, not inventing the product, but perfecting the assembly line that could produce it with ruthless efficiency and on a previously unimaginable scale. The world he created did not vanish. It simply went global, diversified its product line, and upgraded its technology, all while following the corporate playbook, written by a poor Sicilian immigrant on the streets of New York, who understood that in the end, whether you are selling cars or corruption, it all comes down to sound business management. The story of Charles Lucky Luciano is, at its core, a profound and unsettling exploration of the American dream, a narrative that holds a dark mirror to the cherished national myth of upward mobility and reinvention. In the traditional telling, the dream is achieved through hard work, integrity, and innovation within the boundaries of the law. Luciano's life presents a brutal counter-narrative, one in which the same ambitions, to escape poverty, to build an empire, to gain power and respect, are pursued with parallel genius and relentless drive, but channeled through a conduit of violence, corruption, and exploitation. He is the dark doppelganger of the great American industrialists like Rockefeller and Carnegie. Where they used shrewd business practices to build oil and steel empires, Luciano used murder and intimidation to build a syndicate. Where they formed trusts and holding companies to monopolize their industries, he formed the commission to monopolize crime. Where they lobbied politicians to shape laws in their favor, he bribed and threatened them to nullify the law entirely. His journey from the squalor of the lower East Side to the pinnacle of a hidden power structure is a perverse fulfillment of the immigrant promise, a testament to the fact that the same energy that can build a nation can also, if left unchecked by morality or effective governance, build a shadow state within it. This duality forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of success and the systems that enable it. Luciano was not an alien force that invaded America. He was a product of its environment, a creature forged in the crucible of urban poverty, ethnic discrimination, and the vast, unregulated opportunity presented by Prohibition. He looked at the system, understood its vulnerabilities, the pervasive corruption, the public's thirst for forbidden goods, the inefficiency of law enforcement, and he built a better, more ruthless system inside of it. His genius lay in his ability to see crime not as a series of individual acts, but as a market sector ripe for consolidation and modernization. He was the ultimate disruptor, and the industry he disrupted was the underworld itself. This reinterpretation of his life does not absolve him of his monstrous acts, the countless lives destroyed by his prostitution rings, his narcotics network, and his sanctioned murders are a permanent stain on his legacy. But it does complicate the simplistic villain narrative, revealing him as a complex and formidable figure whose impact is inseparable from the story of 20th century America itself. His life coincided with the rise of modern capitalism, and he applied its most coldly efficient principles to his own enterprise. He understood branding, hence the name Lucky, and the carefully cultivated persona. He understood mergers and acquisitions, hence the elimination of Masseria and Maranzano and the formation of the Commission. He understood supply chain logistics, hence his bootlegging operations and the international heroin pipeline. He understood human resources, hence his willingness to promote talent like Lansky and Siegel regardless of their ethnicity. He was, in the most immoral sense possible, a managerial prodigy. His story is also a cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of government action. The Volstead Act, which instituted prohibition, did not create organized crime, but it acted as a massive, multi-billion-dollar stimulus package for it, providing the capital and the impetus for figures like Luciano to build their empires. Similarly, his later collaboration with the U.S. government during World War II, while arguably beneficial to the war effort, created a dangerous moral ambiguity and set a precedent of pragmatism over principle when dealing with criminal enterprises. A precedent that has echoes in later, controversial government collaborations with informants and criminal assets. Luciano's life forces us to acknowledge that the line between the legitimate and the illegitimate worlds is often porous, and that the forces of order and disorder are not always in opposition, but are sometimes engaged in a complex, symbiotic, and deeply compromising dance. He was not an outsider attacking the fortress of society. He was a parasite who learned to live and thrive within its walls, feeding on its weaknesses and mimicking its strengths until his own creation became a dark twin of the host. A parallel America with its own laws, its own economy, and its own grim version of the dream. The human cost of Charles Luciano's corporate empire is a ledger of suffering so vast and so deeply interred in the foundations of modern history that its full balance can never be truly calculated. Each entry representing a life altered, a family destroyed, or a community poisoned, not by the dramatic violence of a gangland shooting, but by the slow, insidious corrosion of his far reaching systems. To understand this cost, one must move beyond the abstract concept of organized crime and focus on the individual human beings who were the raw materials for his machinery of profit. Begin with the thousands of women, many of them immigrants, poor, and with few other options, who were trapped in the elaborate prostitution network that Thomas Dewey so effectively prosecuted. They were not willing entrepreneurs in a libertarian fantasy. They were assets, human inventory to be moved, used, and discarded. Their bodies the medium of exchange in a business transaction from which they derived little benefit and immense harm, subjected to violence, disease, and the constant threat of arrest. Their lives a testament to the utter absence of morality in Luciano's corporate calculus. Then, consider the legions of addicts created by the harrowing pipeline he helped engineer. While he later publicly denounced narcotics, the supply chain he established in the 1940s and 1950s laid the groundwork for the devastation that would sweep through American cities in the following decades. Each individual lost to addiction, each life cut short by overdose, each family torn apart by the desperate need for the next fix, is part of the cascading consequence of that initial corporate decision to traffic in human despair. The poison did not stop at the user. It seeped into the streets, fueling a secondary economy of mugging, theft, and violence as addicts sought to fund their habits, thereby multiplying the victim count exponentially. Beyond these direct victims, there is the broader societal corrosion, the pollution of the body politic. Luciano's empire was built on a foundation of institutional corruption that reached into the highest levels of city government, law enforcement, and the judiciary. Every police officer who took a bribe to look the other way, every union official who rigged a vote under mob pressure, every politician who accepted campaign contributions in exchange for a favorable vote contributed to a pervasive erosion of public trust. This corruption created a two-tiered system of justice, one for the connected and powerful, and another for the ordinary citizen, breeding a deep-seated cynicism about the very possibility of honest governance. The longshoremen who had to kick back a portion of their wages to unload a ship, the garment workers whose unions were puppets of the mob, the small business owners forced to pay protection money. These were all victims of a silent tax imposed by Luciano's shadow government, a tax that stifled economic opportunity and reinforced the very poverty from which he himself had risen. The cost was also paid in blood, not just of rival gangsters, but of innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire of the wars he started and the hits he ordered. The violence he systematized did not always stay neatly contained within the underworld. It spilled out onto the streets, into restaurants and barbershops, creating an atmosphere of fear and lawlessness. And we cannot forget the cost to the soul of the nation itself. The way his success and the subsequent romanticization of the mob in popular culture created a dangerous cultural narrative that often confuses power with prestige and ruthlessness with strength. The image of the successful gangster, the man who made it outside the system, can be a seductive one. particularly for those who feel the legitimate paths to success are closed to them. This glorification, this dark allure, is part of the poison he introduced into the cultural bloodstream. Finally, there is the international cost. The model he perfected was exported globally. The alliances he forged with the Sicilian Mafia revitalized it, empowering the very families that would later unleash a wave of terror in Italy with bombings and assassinations, and who would become central players in the global heroin trade. The corporate structure of the Commission became a template for drug cartels in Latin America and criminal networks in post-Soviet Russia, entities whose violence and corruption have destabilized entire nations. The ledger, therefore, is infinite. It includes the name of every individual who ever suffered, because the system designed to protect them had been compromised by the organization he built. It is written in the lost potential of communities held back by fear and corruption, in the broken families, and in the enduring stain on the institutions we are supposed to be able to trust. Charles Luciano's legacy is not merely the Commission or the 5 families. It is this immense, incalculable mountain of human suffering, a monument to the fact that when crime is corporatized, its victims are not just individuals, but society itself. To dissect the enigmatic character of Charles Luciano is to attempt to solve a complex puzzle where the pieces of ruthless pragmatism, visionary foresight, and a stark emotional void interlock to form a portrait of the perfect modern criminal executive, a man whose inner life remains as shrouded in mystery as his most clandestine business dealings. What drove the boy from Lurcara Fritti to become the architect of a new underworld order? The simplistic explanations of greed or a thirst for power are insufficient. They were present, certainly, but they were merely the fuel, not the engine. The engine was a cold, dispassionate intellect that viewed human relationships, social institutions, and moral codes as variables in a grand strategic equation. Luciano possessed what can only be described as a sociological genius. He had an innate understanding of systems, of how they functioned, where their pressure points were, and how they could be manipulated or replaced. He looked at the chaotic, tribal gangland of the 1920s and saw an inefficient, pre-industrial mess. His revolution was not merely about seizing power for himself, but about imposing a new operating system on the entire industry of crime, one based on stability, predictability, and long-term growth over the short-term spoils of violent conquest. This required a level of emotional detachment that bordered on the pathological. There are no accounts of Luciano being driven by hot, blooded rage or personal vendettas every murder he sanctioned. From the eliminations of Masseria and Maranzano to the countless others, was a clinical corporate decision, a strategic removal of an obstacle or a threat to the organization's health. He did not kill because he hated. He killed because it was expedient. This same detachment extended to his personal relationships. He never married, had no known children, and while he maintained a decades-long partnership with Meyer Lansky, it was always framed in the language of business and mutual advantage. His few romantic liaisons appear to have been transactional arrangements of convenience and pleasure rather than deep emotional connections. He seemed to live entirely within the fortress of his own mind, a solitary king in a castle of his own design, whose only true passion was the exercise of power itself. This is not to say he was without charisma. On the contrary, those who knew him spoke of a quiet, magnetic authority, an ability to command a room without raising his voice. He was a master of silence, using pauses and his low, scar-induced rasp to force others to lean in, to hang on his every word. He understood the theater of power, cultivating an image of the impeccably dressed, unflappable businessman, which stood in stark contrast to the flashy, vulgar gangster stereotype of the era. Yet, beneath this controlled exterior, one can occasionally glimpse flickers of a deeper, more human complexity. His fierce loyalty to Lansky and Siegel, while certainly pragmatic, had its roots in the shared experience of childhood on the streets, a bond forged in the fires of shared struggle that perhaps represented the closest thing to genuine friendship he ever allowed himself. His vehement, lifelong bitterness over his prostitution conviction also reveals a vulnerability. He seemed genuinely offended that he was remembered by the public as a pimp. A sordid label, he felt, was beneath a man of his stature and vision. He wanted to be remembered as a strategist, an innovator, a kingmaker, not as an exploiter of women. This points to a deep-seated, if twisted, desire for a certain kind of respect, a legacy that acknowledged his brilliance, even as it condemned his evil. He was, in many ways, the ultimate self, made man in the most darkly American sense. A boy with nothing who used his wits and his will to build an empire. And he was infuriated that the official record would not grant him the recognition for his entrepreneurial genius. In his final years, his cooperation with biographers was a desperate attempt to curate this legacy, to shape the narrative from Lucky Luciano the gangster to Charles Luciano the visionary. This internal contradiction, the man who felt above the moral judgments of the world, yet craved its understanding, is the final, unresolved mystery at the heart of his character. He was a man who built a world where sentiment was a weakness. Yet he could not entirely escape the human desire for his story to be told, and told in a way that acknowledged the scale of his ambition, if not the devastation it left in its wake. He was a hollow king, a brilliant architect of a palace built on sand, who in his quieter moments in Naples, staring out at the sea that separated him from his kingdom, must have contemplated the profound emptiness that lies at the core of a life devoted entirely to power, a life where every human connection is ultimately just another transaction in the endless, cold calculus of control, the final, enduring enigma of Charles Lucky Luciano. The question that continues to hover over his grave like a persistent fog is not who he was or what he did, but the ultimate meaning of his life's work. Was he, in the cold, objective analysis of history, a success or a failure? The answer is as complex and contradictory as the man himself, a verdict that depends entirely on the scale one uses to measure. If the metric is raw, worldly power, and the lasting impact of an idea, then Luciano stands as one of the most successful criminals of the modern era. He achieved what no one before him had even conceived. He corporatized violence. He took a sector of human activity defined by its chaos and inefficiency and imposed upon it a structure so logical, so resilient, that it survived his own imprisonment, exile, and death for generations. The Commission was his masterpiece, a governing body that brought a semblance of order to the American underworld and became the template for organized crime across the globe. He amassed a fortune that is incalculable, wielded power that made city mayors and police commissioners his unwitting servants, and lived a life of luxury and influence that was the polar opposite of the poverty into which he was born. He died in his bed, not in a gutter or an electric chair, a feat that eluded most of his contemporaries. By these measures, power, wealth, influence, legacy, he was a monumental success, a self-made king of a shadow nation. But if the metric is measured in terms of personal fulfillment, freedom, and the achievement of his deepest desires, then his life must be judged a profound and tragic failure. The man who sought to control everything ended up controlling nothing of his own destiny. He was exiled from the country he considered his home, forcibly separated from the empire he built, and spent his final years as a spectral figure, watched constantly. His power diminished to the point of irrelevance. The corporate model he created, while enduring, was ultimately co-opted and corrupted by lesser men like Vito Genovese, whose greed and paranoia ignited the very internal wars the Commission was designed to prevent. He was forced to watch from afar as his life's work was mismanaged, its principles abandoned. The public legacy he so desperately wanted to control was cemented not as a visionary, but as a convicted pimp, a label that haunted him until his last breath. He had no family, no children to carry on his name or his bloodline. The vast wealth he accumulated could not buy him a ticket back to New York, could not purchase the genuine respect of the society he manipulated, and could not fill the evident void in his solitary existence. He was, in the end, a prisoner, first of Dannemora and Great Meadow, and later of the entire Italian peninsula, a captive of his own notoriety. This is the central tragedy of Lucky Luciano. The ultimate price of his power was his own freedom. He built a cage for the entire American underworld, only to find that he had constructed the most secure cell for himself. Furthermore, his success came at an unimaginable human cost that stains any notion of triumph. The thousands of lives destroyed by his enterprises, the women in his brothels, the addicts hooked on his heroin, the citizens whose trust in government was eroded by his corruption, form a mountain of suffering that forever negates any personal victory. A legacy built on such a foundation is not a monument, it is a cemetery. So, was he a success or a failure? He was both, simultaneously. He was the triumphant general who won every battle but lost the war for his own soul. He was the brilliant CEO who built a Fortune 500 company but was fired by the board and banned from the industry. He'd achieved everything a poor immigrant boy could dream of, only to discover that the dream was a nightmare. His life stands as a stark eternal warning about the nature of ambition untethered from morality, a demonstration that the pursuit of power for its own sake is a hollow endeavor that ultimately consumes the pursuer. He sought to become a legend, and he succeeded. But the legend is a dark one, a tale not of glory, but of a brilliant light that burned in a vast, empty darkness, illuminating nothing but its own inevitable extinction. He conquered the world, but in doing so, he lost himself, and that is the only final, unequivocal verdict that history can render on the strange, sad, and terrifying life of Salvatore Lucania. As the dust of history settles on the sprawling, blood-soaked saga of Charles "Lucky" Luciano, we are left not with a single, simple conclusion, but with a series of profound and unsettling echoes that continue to resonate through our modern world, forcing us to recognize that the forces he unleashed and the systems he perfected were not an anomaly, but a dark reflection of the very underpinnings of our global society. Luciano's story is often relegated to the genre of true crime, a thrilling but ultimately contained tale of a bygone era of gangsters and moles. This is a comforting but dangerous misconception. The world Luciano engineered is not a relic, it is the prototype, the principles of his corporate syndicate. Globalization, the separation of leadership from direct action, the use of shell corporations and complex financial instruments to launder money, the corruption of public officials to ensure operational security, and the treatment of human beings as expendable assets in the pursuit of profit are not confined to the underworld. They are the hallmarks of the most powerful and, at times, the most ruthless entities in the legitimate global economy. The multinational corporation that exploits legal loopholes, pollutes the environment, and uses its financial muscle to influence legislation in its favor is operating on a version of the Luciano playbook, albeit with lawyers and lobbyists instead of hitmen and bagmen. The offshore banking, heaven that shields the wealth of oligarchs and drug lords from taxation and scrutiny, is the direct descendant of Meyer Lansky's Swiss accounts and Cuban casino schemes, perfected for the digital age. Luciano demonstrated that the most effective way to commit crime on a massive scale is to make it look like business, to blur the lines so completely that it becomes impossible for the law or society to tell the difference. His legacy is the realization that the modern world, with its interconnected economies and complex financial systems, is the perfect environment for sophisticated criminal enterprises to not only survive, but to thrive, often hiding in plain sight. The international drug cartels that today wield power over nation states, the cybercriminal networks that hold data for ransom from remote locations, the human traffickers who move people across borders as if they were contraband. All of these are the children of Luciano's vision, beneficiaries of the model that proved crime could be scaled to an industrial level. He was the first to truly grasp that in the 20th century, power would no longer be measured solely in territory controlled by armies, but in networks controlled by capital and influence. He built his network in the shadows, but its blueprint has been studied and replicated across the globe. Furthermore, His life forces an uncomfortable examination of the American narrative itself. He is the dark embodiment of the self-made man, a living refutation of the idea that the system inevitably rewards hard work and virtue. He proved that the system could be hacked, that its rules were not absolute, and that for those with the intelligence and the ruthlessness to see its flaws, there was a faster, more direct path to the top, even if that path was paved with the bones of his victims. His journey from immigrant poverty to the pinnacle of a secret power structure holds a perverse inspiration for those who feel disenfranchised by the legitimate avenues of advancement, a dangerous testament to the allure of building your own system when the existing one seems rigid or inaccessible. The story of Lucky Luciano is therefore not a closed chapter. It is an ongoing lesson. It is a warning about the fragility of our institutions in the face of determined, moral intelligence. It is a cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of well-intentioned laws like prohibition that can create monstrous black markets. It is a mirror held up to our own society, asking us how much we are willing to tolerate, how much corruption we are willing to overlook, and where we choose to draw the line between aggressive business and outright criminality. The ghost of Lucky Luciano does not haunt the cemeteries of Naples. It haunts the boardrooms of multinational corporations, the halls of government, and the shadowy servers of the dark web, a reminder that the most dangerous criminals are not the ones who break the law, but the ones who learn how to rewrite it for their own benefit. And so we arrive at the end of our journey, a voyage that began in the teeming tenements of the Lower East Side and concludes in a quiet, overlooked grave in Naples. A journey that has traced the arc of a life so monumental in its darkness that its shadow still falls across our world. The story of Charles Lucky Luciano is more than a biography. It is a foundational myth for the modern age of illicit power, a creation story for the hidden architecture that governs the underworld and subtly influences our own. We have witnessed the rise of the ambitious boy, Salvatore Lucania, who looked upon the chaos of street crime and saw the blueprint for a corporation. We have followed the cunning young man who orchestrated the murders of his bosses, not out of mere ambition, but to clear the way for a revolutionary new structure, the Commission, a board of directors for American Vice. We have seen the corporate kingpin at the height of his power, operating from a suite at the Waldorf Astoria, his word law from the docks of New York to the nascent casinos of Havana and Las Vegas. We have felt the shock of his dramatic fall, engineered by the relentless Thomas Dewey, and the surreal twist of his wartime collaboration. A pact with the government that saw the patriot and the pariah become indistinguishable. We have observed his bitter exile, a king in absentia, watching from across the ocean as his empire was mismanaged and corrupted by lesser men, his vision fading into the very chaos he had sought to eliminate. And we have contemplated his complex and contradictory legacy, a tapestry woven with threads of brutal efficiency, visionary strategy, and incalculable human suffering. The lesson of Luciano is not that crime does not pay for him, it paid handsomely for a time. The true lesson is far more nuanced and far more frightening. It is that the mechanisms of power are neutral, and they can be wielded by anyone with the intelligence and the will to do so, regardless of their morality. Luciano proved that the principles of corporate governance, structure, dispute resolution, long-term planning, and diversification could be applied to an industry of violence and exploitation with devastating effectiveness. He was the ultimate innovator, and his innovation was to make crime boring, to make it administrative, to make it a business like any other. Only its product was human misery. His story forces us to look beyond the simplistic archetype of the gangster and recognize the bureaucrat of evil, the executive of pain. As we leave his story behind, we must carry with us this heightened awareness, this understanding that the greatest threats to our society are often not the chaotic forces of anarchy, but the cold, calculated, and highly organized systems that operate just beyond the edge of the law. Systems that look and function disturbingly like the legitimate world they prey upon. The life of Lucky Luciano is a permanent stain on the canvas of the 20th century, a dark masterpiece painted in shades of blood and gold. It is a story that needed to be told, not to glorify, but to understand, to educate, and to warn. And with that, our narrative is complete. If this journey into the shadowy heart of a criminal empire has captivated you, if it has shed light on the hidden forces that shape our world, then I must now issue a final call to action. Your engagement is what allows us to continue unearthing these complex and critical stories. Please show your support by subscribing to this channel and hitting the like button. Ring the notification bell so you do not miss our next deep dive into the stories that history has tried to forget, the narratives that lie just beneath the surface of our accepted reality. Share your thoughts, your reflections on this saga in the comments below. We are a community of learners, and your perspective is valued. The story of power, corruption, and the human cost of ambition is never truly over. It simply finds new actors and new stages. Thank you for listening. Thank you for embarking on this dark odyssey. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and never stop seeking the truth, no matter how unsettling it may be.